All right. Welcome everyone to today's session of Thirsting for Theoretical Biology. Today's session is focused on endosomal trafficking. Endosomal trafficking, of course, is complex and very dynamic as an organizational entity in the cell. We have two fantastic speakers, one of them who experimentally explores the system, and the other who uses theoretical biology to model vesicular dynamics and different trafficking principles. Right. So before we start, some house rules. Please mute yourself at all times except for the Q&A, or if you're a speaker, please turn off your cameras to save the bandwidth. Speakers will have certain question answer pauses, and they will indicate, and during that time, you could ask your questions. You could also type in your questions in the chat window, and during the question answer sessions, I will allow you to unmute yourself and indicate that you can go forward with asking your questions. Without further ado, I would like to have Mehak Sharma, who is from ICER Mohali. She works on molecular mechanisms regulating endosomal trafficking. Mehak, if you can take off, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Senthil. And I want to thank Vaishnavi, Vijay, and Vidyanand for the invite. Before I begin, I must confess that this is my first run with the theoretical biology group, and the hope is that um, I have chosen a topic for today that I think can be visualized at the whole cell scale and can greatly benefit from approaches of theoretical biology. So while I'm excited to share my talk with you, I'm a little bit apprehensive that, because we are going to go into specific molecular details and protein-protein interaction. And the challenge is that to keep you engaged till the end, but also to stimulate some thoughts, where this process of lysosome positioning probably can be studied more, in more depth with a combination of experimental and theoretical approaches. So for close to 10 years now, my lab has been, studying a small subset of proteins that are localized on lysosomes, and these proteins function in regulating cargo trafficking to lysosomes and also regulates the positioning of this compartment, which is surprisingly, seeming to be important for many functions that this particular organelle does. And I'll, try to convey that point through this talk. So before we delve into details, let's zoom out first. Uh, like a real city, actually, uh, the endomembrane system of the cell, the bulk of lysosomes, late endosomes, early endosomes, vesicles from the trans-Golgi network are actually accumulated in a crowded space, this what is called as a perinuclear cloud. Um, and with the only exception being ER, which extends to the, to the periphery of the cell. Um, and so this kind of spatial arrangement of the endomembrane system of the cell has consequences for vesicular transport, probably for other processes as well, that that are yet to be studied in depth. But to look at vesicular transport and the consequence of this spatial arrangement for this process, let's go to the next slide. So as I said, that the endolysosomal system is compartmentalized in cellular space, and this has a consequence for vesicular transport in the sense that the nascent endosomes are formed in the peripheral space, the quieter suburbs, as one would say. And these nascent endosomes acquire content from the plasma membrane, the signaling receptors, or the luminal proteins such as nutrients, and they will be encapsulated in a compartment called as the early endosomes, and also known as the sorting endosomes, because this is the compartment from where the cargo which is destined for degradation will be sorted away from the cargo which ends up recycling back to the cell surface. Now this compartment, as it moves from the periphery of the cell towards the perinuclear region, driven by primarily the microtubule-based motor protein dynein, undergoes a process which we call as endosome maturation. So the protein and the lipid content of this endosome changes over time, and also the morphology of this compartment changes with now presence of these many intraluminal vesicles which will trap the cargo which is destined for degradation. And in this perinuclear cloud is where these endosomal compartments are thought to meet, the proteolytic center of the cell, the lysosomes. And the bulk of these lysosomes are residing in this region with the exception that few of these lysosomes will also be present in the periphery of the cell, driven here by the, one of the kinesin motors. And so this spatial arrangement ensures that only a mature endosome, undergoes fusion, tethering and fusion with the lysosomes, and subsequently cargo degradation can take place. The same process also happens when cells, instead of internalizing the cargo from extracellular environment or the plasma membrane, rather engulf cargo which is present inside the cytosol, the worn out organelles or protein aggregates, which are trapped in this double membrane structure called as autophagosome, which akin to endosome maturation process, undergoes maturation, moves into the perinuclear region where they meet the lysosomes, and fusion of autophagosomes and lysosomes then eventually leads to degradation of the autophagic material of the cell. So while many aspects of these processes have been well studied, and the positioning of these compartments is an active area of research, for today's talk, I'm only focusing on one aspect of the spatial positioning of these endolysosomal system, which is how lysosomes are positioned in the cell, where I wanted to share with you our work on the small g proteins and their effectors, which are motor adapters, and they are involved in positioning of the lysosomal system and the significance of this process in cargo trafficking to lysosomes. So I thought that I'll introduce to you some basic facts about lysosomes. What do we know about them? So lysosomes, the word itself derived from the fact that they are lytic compartments, and are almost a spherical organelle with a typical size ranging from 100, 200 to 500 nanometers, and their numbers can vary from something like 50 to 1,000 of lysosomes in cultured cell lines. Both the size and the number of this compartment is under regulation. So under conditions when we alter the physiological environment of the cell, there is a change in the size of these organelles as well as the numbers. And under many pathological conditions such as neurodegenerative disorders or lysosomal storage diseases, we see that both of these aspects of lysosomes are altered. The most well-known fact about these compartments is the fact that they have an acidic pH, which is rich in hydrolytic enzymes. The pH is maintained by this transporter on the surface of lysosomes, the vacuolar ATPase pump. Lysosomes contain an abundant amount of these glycoproteins, which are called as LAMPs. And because of their abundance on the surface of lysosomes, they are heavily used as markers to stain these compartments. But in addition to these transmembrane proteins, lysosomes also contain many transporters which transport the degraded material, the building blocks from the lumen of the lysosomes into the cytosol for synthesis of new molecules. So for these reasons, lysosomes are regarded as the recycling center of the cell. The proteins that my lab is interested in are sitting here, which are the small g proteins and their effectors such as the tethering factors which associate with snares. And this entire machinery of the small g proteins, tethering factor and snares is what mediates the fusion between a lysosome and an endosome or an autophagosome that we saw in the previous slide. The G proteins also interact with motor adapters and recruit the bidirectional motors, dynein and kinesin, on the surface of these compartments to ensure their distribution in the cell. It's important to mention here that, while this was, this was known for a long time about these lytic organelles, work from the Sabatini and Balabio group actually have made some surprising discoveries about these organelles. The fact that there are signaling complexes that sit on lysosomal surface and mediate, signaling from these surfaces to allow cells to synthesize new proteins and to grow, as well as presence of transcription factors on the surface of lysosomes, which allow, gene expression to be turned on under certain conditions so that lysosomes can regulate their own biogenesis, have actually brought a wave of excitement about these organelles, which actually for a very long time were regarded as this, the garbage disposal system of the cell, because of the fact that their only role in the cell was thought to be degradation of the cellular cargo. But with these seminal work, you know, showing presence of signaling complexes and transcription factors, it's almost reincarnated the image of lysosomes as the control center for cell homeostasis. And almost we can say that lysosomes are having a Cinderella moment where, these organelles are not considered now to be these, picking up the cellular trash, the garbage disposal system of the cell, but rather as the, control center of the cell that determines how cells would respond to extracellular environment in terms of the nutrients and growth factors. So lysosomes, now we know that they have several other functions besides degradation, and primarily many of these functions are determined by what is happening on the surface of these organelles. So for instance, lysosomes respond to the level of nutrients in the cell, and depending upon the level of nutrients, they would ensure that cells exhibit an anabolic phenotype or a catabolic phenotype. And I'll discuss this a little bit in my upcoming slides. Lysosomes have been shown to interact with machinery which is present at the cell surface called as focal adhesions. And through this, they help in assembly and disassembly of these complexes to mediate cell migration, something which was very much unexpected and very much far away from their, the degradative role. And more recently, lysosomes contact with other organelles has been shown to have a functional consequence. The most well described being the contact with the endoplasmic reticulum, and how lysosomes are helping in shaping the ER architecture of the cell. So these are the functions of lysosomes at the cellular level. And this has a manifestation at the organismal level, with the strongest link of these compartments shown to be with the, the aging phenotype of an organism. So lysosome dysfunction has been shown to be a very prominent feature of aging organisms. And rather, it has been shown that if you can reverse lysosome dysfunction, you can probably extend the lifespan of the individual. And also at the organismal level, lysosomes have been shown to play a role in processes such as bone resorption, as well as in differentiation of stem cells. So more and more of these functions of lysosomes have been actually, linked to where they are sitting in the cell. And this is a concept that I would like to explain in my coming slide. So lysosome positioning, where they are present in the cell, seems to be, influencing many of their conventional and newly appreciated functions. So whether they are present in this perinuclear immobile pool, or whether they escape this perinuclear pool and now are present at the periphery of the cell, seems to be regulating, several of these aspects of lysosomal biology. And this was appreciated more when it was found that variety of, factors, both extracellular as well as intracellular, can influence the lysosomal distribution in the cell. So for instance, presence or absence of nutrients has shown to regulate lysosomal distribution. Uh, what is the pH of the cytosol regulates where the lysosomes are present. Interestingly, many pathogenic agents have been shown to change or alter the distribution of lysosomes, and there is a functional consequence to this, which we are not discussing today. But agents, pathogenic organisms like viruses as well as bacteria like Salmonella have been shown to alter the distribution of lysosomes, with a consequence to pathogen survival and replication in the cell. So before we move ahead, I thought that I can show you how lysosomes are positioned in a typical cultured mammalian cell. And so I'm playing out this video for you, which is what you are seeing here. These spherical organelles are lysosomes, which are loaded with a particular compound called as dextrin, which is fluorescently tagged. So what we do in these experiments is we incubate this particular polysaccharide with the cell, and it is endocytosed by the cell over time. And if you do a short pulse and a long chase of this uh, particular substrate, it will accumulate, by default in the terminal compartment, and this is not generally degraded by the cell, and so you can visualize lysosomes using such an approach. And these are HeLa cells in which we have done this experiment. So immediately when you see the steady state image here, what is clear is that there is this, strong perinuclear accumulation of lysosomes in the cell near the nucleus. And as I play out this video, you can see that the perinuclear lysosomes are actually quite immobile, probably exhibiting only like constrained diffusion movements. And there are reasons for why these lysosomes show such a behavior. I'll come to that in a minute. But you also find that some of these lysosomes escape this perinuclear cloud and move into the highways, the microtubule tracts, which are extending to the periphery of the cell. And these lysosomes then show this, long range bidirectional transport. And they can even reach the periphery of the cell, where some of them will actually fall off the microtubule tract and move on to the actin tracts. The movement of lysosomes in typical cultured mammalian cells have been labeled as a stop and go movement. So they stop or pause for a little while, and then they move couple of micrometers in the either periphery of the cell. So when I was, reading and thinking about this presentation, I was looking if there is any work that has been done on the lysosomal distribution at the whole cell level. And fortunately, I found this one particular study by the group of Yi Wang at Carnegie Mellon. And I thought that, I'll discuss this work here in this presentation because probably it's relevant for the audience here. So predominantly, and I vouch for this, the predominant view, amongst the experimentalists probably was that lysosomes behave as individual entities, and they mostly act independently, interacting with organelles in a random fashion. However, using some mathematical modeling techniques, such as mentioned here, spatial statistical analysis, this particular group has shown that there is actually a pattern in the behavior of lysosomes. So despite the fact that lysosomes are dynamic organelles, they exhibit this extensive long distance movement. Actually, the distribution of lysosomes in the cell remains stable. It exhibits a non-random stable behavior at the whole cell scale. And what these authors find is that, the lysosomes have this strong immobile pool where they can form dynamic clusters, which are ranging from, the number of lysosomes in these clusters could be ranging from 8 to up to 200 lysosomes. And these clusters can form dynamically throughout the intracellular space, but more so in the proximity of the perinuclear region. And they find that it is within these dynamic clusters that lysosomes show more contacts with other organelles such as late endosomes. And probably these contacts or these transient fusion events are where, these compartments are sharing content for degradation. They find that there are three key players which are regulating lysosomal distribution in the cell. One obvious is the microtubule based active transport, which is regulating the directed movement of these compartments, and it is ensuring the distance of lysosomes from the perinuclear region. They find that lysosomes are also, the distribution of lysosomes is partially regulated by actin cytoskeleton, and disruption of actin cytoskeleton actually changes the the pairwise distance between these lysosomes. So it impacts the the diffusion, the constrained diffusion of these lysosomes. And the third key player actually, which these authors find, is the endoplasmic reticulum network, which plays an important role in confining or restricting the movement of lysosomes, because lysosomes, or most late endosomes and lysosomes in cells, are actually tethered to the ER. And this tethering of the ER is a very important aspect which regulates their movement, or escape from the perinuclear cloud to the peripheral space. So, I thought that, this is an important work that could be discussed here in this forum, and probably also as an example how theoretical approaches can be used to study the distribution of these compartments at the whole cell scale. So coming back to, lysosome positioning and the factors that influence lysosome distribution in the cell, I thought that I'll discuss one of these factors which we know and is also a well-established regulator of lysosomal distribution, with some idea about the consequences of this on the metabolic signaling events in the cell. So let's see this. In cells which are present in complete media, where there is an abundance of nutrients and growth factors, you see this typical distribution of lysosomes in the cell with the perinuclear pool and a peripheral pool. So this you can appreciate in this image on the left, where you are looking at lysosomes stained with this marker protein LAMP1 in HeLa cells, and this is under conditions of complete media where there are growth factors and nutrients present. And so you can see the perinuclear cloud of lysosomes, but also the fact that many of these lysosomes reach to the periphery of the cell. Now, within 2 to 4 hours of exposure to conditions where these growth factors and nutrients are lacking, what one finds is that lysosomes are all now clustered into the perinuclear region of the cell, and they are conspicuously missing from the peripheral space. And the same thing can be observed if you remove only amino acids from the media while keeping growth factors and glucose there in the media. You can still see a strong, striking perinuclear accumulation of lysosomes. So over the years, so this was noted some, like a couple of years back. These observations were made primarily by the group of David Rubinstein, but also then recapitulated in many other labs. And then eventually it was realized that there is a functional implication of this distribution of this compartment for the cell. And in the next slides, I want to tell you about what is the functional implication of this, nutrient dependent repositioning of lysosomes. So in cells which are present in complete media containing nutrients and growth factors, lysosomes are thought to be present in the peripheral space, and signaling complexes, prominent of which is this enzyme called as mTORC1, a serine threonine kinase, which resides on the surface of lysosomes, and signals from the surface of lysosomes is also present in this peripheral space, where now it can be activated by these growth factors, uh, you know, as well as by proteins which are part of the focal adhesion complexes. So the fact that lysosomes and lysosomal proteins like mTOR kinase are present in the peripheral space brings this kinase in the proximity of the upstream signaling factors, allowing for a faster activation of this particular kinase. And what does this kinase do in the cell? It stimulates protein synthesis, ribosome synthesis, etc. And therefore, when there is nutrients and growth factors present, the outcome of such a cellular fate would be an anabolic phenotype, where the cells will synthesize proteins, lipids, and make new organelles. Now, when you remove the nutrients and growth factors from the media, and now what we have is a starvation, a media in which the cells are starving, what we see is that this immediate repositioning of lysosomes to the perinuclear region, and the strong clustering of lysosomes to the perinuclear region, where they can now encounter the newly formed autophagosomes formed so in the presence of this starvation media. And this clustering of these compartments in this highly crowded perinuclear space allows for more contacts, transient and complete fusion of lysosomes with these compartments, leading to degradation of the autophagic cargo and then recycling of the contents from this degradation into the cytosol, allowing for the replenishment of the nutrients. So, suggesting that, under starvation, lysosomes are playing a more catabolic role instead of the signaling role that we see in the presence of nutrients and growth factors. And so, because of these observations, the lysosome positioning, especially nutrient-dependent lysosome positioning, has become a very relevant topic of study. In the past 5 years or so, there are many publications that are exploring this aspect of lysosome repositioning. So with that, I want to now come to some of the specific key molecular players, one of which we have been extensively studying in my lab, which determines how lysosomes are positioned in the cell. So Senthil, I think I can stop here and I can take if there are any questions from the audience.
Yes, there are some questions. It's fantastic time. Sana Kahira Khan, if you would like to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask the question.
Hello?
Yeah, Sana, hi.
Yeah, hi. So I was wondering, you mentioned that lysosomes are also involved in cell migration. So I was wondering when exactly this happens. Is that happening at an early developmental stage, say an embryonic stage, or is that happening later in life?
Sana, right at the outset, these processes, as far as I know, have not been studied at the organismal level. They have been mostly studied in cultured cell lines for
Okay.
now, because this is a very new area of research. So I can answer it from that perspective. In cells which are derived, let's say, from adult organisms, you see that uh, if you change the distribution of lysosomes in the cell, they are no longer in contact with organelles like molecular complexes like the focal adhesion complexes. And this can change the dynamics of focal adhesions. So focal adhesions in the cell, they undergo assembly and disassembly. And in a migrating cell, this process is very important, that focal adhesions exhibit this dynamics, because as the cell is migrating, it needs to quickly disassemble focal adhesions from the retracting edge and assemble them in the leading edge. And this process seems to be dependent on lysosomes. Whether lysosomes here are degrading a certain component of focal adhesion is not clear. Um, so what lysosomes are exactly doing, how they are regulating the dynamics of focal adhesion not clear at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Vaibhav Vosnik, if you
Okay.
want to unmute yourself.
Hi, Mac. I had a question. You can hear me, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So I had a few questions. One thing is, I think so. Which were is it that during the nutrition phase, the liposomes are basically crowded near the cell membrane, and during the catabolic phase, they are basically crowded near the nuclear membrane. Is that what is happening, or is it always that the majority of the liposomes are near the nuclear membrane?
Yeah, so generally majority of the lysosomes, they will be observed in the perinuclear region, but you will have a substantial pool which is, near the plasma membrane as well.
Okay.
But under nutrient deprivation conditions, we see that the lysosomes are missing from the cell periphery. Maybe the boundary of the cell is less clear here, but
No, but
lysosomes are all strongly clustered in the perinuclear region and absent from the peripheral space.
Okay. The other question was, what decides? You were talking about the motion of these liposomes on microtubules, but you also said that they could jump onto actin tracks. Is there some different function that is happening when they jump onto actin tracks?
So one of the functions that I think is happening when they jump on the actin tracks could be interaction with focal adhesions, because I've not shown this here, but focal adhesions will be, they will have polymerized actin branching out. And so, the guess is that the lysosomes which are actually interacting with the focal adhesions have left the microtubule track and are now present on the actin tracks. And the other function that can happen when lysosomes are on the actin track is that they can actually undergo fusion with the plasma membrane and release their contents into the extracellular environment, which is a very important process in certain, for certain processes like degradation of the bone matrix, or for the degradation of extracellular matrix by cancer cells when they are metastasizing.
Okay. And the final question, you talked about these liposomes forming clusters. I mean, obviously there must be some kind of a distribution. I mean, do you have any idea? Is this like a Gaussian distribution or something like that? Or, or is there something else specific over here?
So we have not particularly done this analysis, in our own work, but I'll just refer to you to this publication. I think G. Wang's group shows that there are two peaks. So what they get is that there are two different peaks of lysosomal distribution. I think that they represent the peripheral and the perinuclear pool. When they are looking at the whole cell scale level, they find that there are two populations of lysosomes. They don't define it, what are these two populations? My guess is that they represent the perinuclear pool and probably the peripheral pool of lysosomes.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks.
Right. Next is Priyant.
Hi, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, ma'am. My question is that under what circumstances does the transition of perinuclear lysosomes to peripheral lysosomes happen, considering that the perinuclear lysosomes have to expend a lot of energy by getting onto the microtubule tracks and reaching and covering a long distance to become a peripheral lysosome. So the circumstances must be really essential for the lysosome or the cell for it to undergo this transition. So under what circumstances does this transition happen from a global point of view?
So Priyam, my guess is, so I'm again using this example of nutrient. I'm using nutrients as a cue here because this is the most well understood condition under which lysosomes would exhibit this change of positioning. So let us imagine that the cells have received nutrients and growth factors, and now the cell is prepared to synthesize new machinery, new proteins and lipids, new organelle synthesis. For that, it needs to activate this master regulator kinase, mTOR, which will then initiate these processes of protein synthesis, of ribosome synthesis. So my guess would be that if there are enough nutrients available in the extracellular environment, uh, lysosomes would, using probably the motor proteins, would then traffic towards the cell surface, where they would, have close encounters with the growth factors, as well as, let's say, focal adhesion complexes, which can then stimulate, mTORC activity, and this would then initiate the process of protein synthesis. So this would be a good use of, the energy that is dissipated when lysosomes are moving from the perinuclear cloud to the periphery.
Okay, ma'am. Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Next is Shrilaja.
Mehak, I was wondering, so when lysosomes under nutrient stress conditions end up catabolizing stuff, is there any change in the size of the cell? So I guess my broader question is that what does the lysosomal pathway prefer to utilize first in terms of nutrients when external nutrients are starved? Is that known?
I'm trying to think if this is, um, so probably an autophagy expert could have answered this question, that which particular organelles are most quickly utilized under conditions of starvation. Yeah, I'm not sure, Srilaja, if I can predict which it would be. I do want to mention that, we see a change in the cell size under conditions of starvation.
Okay.
The spread area of the cells, greatly reduce under conditions of starvation.
Okay. Which sort of makes sense. I mean, it kind of makes sense that it might prefer to use membrane or lipids first.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm not. And if so, then the change in size of the cell makes sense. So
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there might be some literature out there that under condition of starvation, which autophagy or which particular component has been, is the most robust or most prominent.
yeah. Okay, thank you.
Next is Shivani.
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah, Shivani.
I wanted to know how lysosomes recognize the shortage of nutrients in a cell.
Okay, excellent point. So one of the ways is something that I'll talk about in my coming slides. But primarily what happens is that the proteins that recognize, the proteins that recognize, let's say, the plus end motors, kinesins, for instance, they will be removed from the surface of lysosomes. And now what you will have a dynein driven movement of lysosomes towards the perinuclear center. That is one way, but I think that one of the other ways could be a change in the contact between endoplasmic reticulum and lysosomes. And that is something that remains unexplored, that under conditions of starvation, how does the ER and lysosome contacts are changed so that, lysosomes can probably move into the perinuclear space. The obvious answer that comes to my mind is that proteins that recognize enterograde motors will be removed from the surface of lysosomes, so that now the dynein driven transport to the perinuclear center can begin or can take place.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
In the interest of time, I'm going to just combine two questions which are similar.
Yeah.
In the lysosome movie, we also see that some lysosomes oscillate. What causes this? And the second question is the positioning pattern of lysosome same for all cell types?
Yeah. So the answer to the first question is, I think that there are the motors kinesin and dynein are, attaching and detaching from the lysosomal surface. And so sometimes you can see this oscillating behavior of lysosomes. My guess is it depends on, which motor is kind of carrying the lysosomal cargo. and that determines this oscillating behavior. Another aspect that I just said could be detachment from an ER tubule and then reattachment. So I think that can also contribute to this stop and go movement of lysosome. Uh, and that is for the lysosomes that are actually moving, that are exposed to the fast directional or processive transport. Because generally this perinuclear pool of lysosomes will exhibit more constrained diffusion. They will move somewhere between 0.3 to 0.5 micrometer and not beyond that. And the answer to the second question is that yes, in many of the cultured cell lines, you would see this kind of distribution of lysosomes, that they have a very, clustered perinuclear pool, and but also, they are reaching out to the cell periphery near the plasma membrane. So this positioning or this distribution of lysosomes is very typical of many different cultured cell lines.
All right, thank you, Mehak, for all the answers. Unfortunately, we'll not be able to take more questions in the interest of time. Please type in your questions in the Slack channel. Mehak, you can continue with your talk.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, as I was mentioning that, now let's look at some of the mechanisms that regulate lysosome positioning. And for the purposes of today's talk, I'm actually only referring to one particular protein which regulates lysosome positioning, and has been, very well established regulator of lysosome positioning. I can almost say that if it is a lysosome positioning study, it's hard not to look at this particular molecule, and which is this a member of this ARF-like small GTP binding protein family called as RL8. And the RL8 protein, as soon as it was cloned and expressed in the cells, it was very clear that this is a protein which is regulating lysosomal distribution. So I remember doing this experiment where, we were looking at lysosomes in control cells as well as in RL8 knockdown cells. And there was this remarkable redistribution of lysosomes near the perinuclear region upon RL8 depletion. And which is, I think, this kind of remarkable phenotype is what drove a lot of people to study this molecule as a regulator of lysosomal distribution. And conversely, if you overexpress RL8, and these are in HeLa cells, if you overexpress RL8, what you find is that now you see a reduction in the perinuclear immobile pool of lysosomes, and rather you see that at the tips of the cells, you see accumulation of the LAMP1 or the lysosomal compartments. So clearly it seems that the levels of RL8 in the cell are regulating lysosomal distribution, where cells depleted of RL8 show this profound clustering of lysosomes in the perinuclear pool, and cells which are, with enhanced expression of this G protein show lysosomes at the tips of the cell reaching into the far periphery. And while I'm only showing you an image in this cultured cell line, this phenotype has been recapitulated in different cell lines in model organisms such as C. elegans and in Drosophila, where it has been shown that the function of RL8 is conserved across evolution in regulating lysosomal distribution. Now, it's not surprising that you see such profound change in this compartment by expression of this small GTP binding protein, because small G proteins, for instance, like RL8, have already been shown to to regulate multiple steps of vesicular trafficking, whether it is uncoating of the or formation of the vesicle by uncoating of the coat proteins, movement of these organelles or vesicles on the microtubule tracts, their association with tethering factors, and subsequently fusion. And the endocytic system in the cell is decorated, and both endocytic and the secretory system of the cell is decorated with these small GTP binding proteins of the RABs, ARFs, and RL family, as shown in this schematic, with one of the most well characterized small G protein RAB5, which is present on the early endosome, and RAB7, which shares this or has an overlapping distribution with RL8 on late endosomes and lysosomes. So the small G proteins, we now know that they work through their effectors. So they behave as molecular switches, switching from a GTP bound state. So shown here are this, a triphosphate state. So they switch between this triphosphate state to a diphosphate state. So exchanging GTP for GTP, and in their active state, which is the GTP bound state, they localize to specific membranes, and this would be the lysosomal membrane for a G protein like RL8 or RAB7. And in their GTP bound state, the G proteins will recruit or interact with their effector proteins, and the effectors can then have a varying activity which helps in facilitating the process of vesicular transport, like budding of the vesicles, motility of vesicles or organelles, tethering of these vesicles. So in an approach to understand what the small G protein is doing at a particular compartment, it is important to identify their interaction partners or their effectors. And one of the common approaches that is used is this, fishing expedition like approach, where you can take a cell lysate and pass it through an immobilized, let's say tagged G protein. Generally, the G protein will be used in a configuration in which it stays in a GTP bound or the active state, so that you can pull out the effector proteins from the lysate, and then identification of these interacting partners. And in doing such experiments, my lab and several other colleagues who are working in the field have identified number of these effectors. One of the earliest effectors, or the first effector of this small G protein that was identified, was a protein called as SCIP. And this was by the lab of Sean Munro at MRC. And, identification of this effector actually gave clarity to how RL8 mediates lysosome positioning, because this particular effector protein called as SCIP, it has binding sites for RL8. So it binds to RL8 via this particular domain called as run domain, but it also has binding sites for the kinesin 1 motor. So in this way, this effector of RL8 can recruit the kinesin motor on the surface of lysosomes and promote the enterograde motility of lysosomes that we see when RL8 or SCIP is expressed in the cell. So just to appreciate this point further, we can see in this particular image that RL8, it's localized on the lysosomes stained here with LAMP1, and you see some accumulation of RL8 on the peripheral lysosomes. But when you co-express RL8 with its effector SCIP, what you find is this very strong peripheral, distribution of lysosomes. And actually, in this particular example, we do not see any RL8 positive structures, or it's hard to appreciate any RL8 positive structures in the perinuclear region. And there is a profound movement of these structures towards the periphery of the cell, driven through the kinesin motor. And the reverse experiment, as we saw with RL8 knockdown, this perinuclear accumulation of lysosomes. Similarly, depletion of SCIP in the cells also gives a phenotype which mimics RL8, in the sense that now you have a very strong perinuclear accumulation of lysosomes. Now, over the years, it has been established that RL8, in association with SCIP and kinesin 1, regulates this nutrient-dependent positioning of lysosomes, as one would have expected. It regulates activation of mTORC1, the serine threonine kinase. So in this way, RL8 and its effector proteins determine that anabolic phenotype of the cell that we see in the presence of nutrients. In addition, this particular molecular machinery regulates events which happen between lysosomes and the plasma membrane, such as repair of the plasma membrane patches in which, lysosomes exocytose fuse with the plasma membrane and donate their membrane to seal the gap in the membrane. This is called as a plasma membrane repair event. As well as RL8 skip complex has been shown to regulate exocytosis of both the conventional lysosomes as well as exocytosis of lysosomes related organelles such as lytic granules, which are present in specialized cells like natural killer cells or cytotoxic T lymphocytes, which are the immune cells. RL8 skip and kinesin 1 complex has also been shown to be important for tubulation of these lysosomes, and this process is still, somewhat kind of an active area of research, that, why do lysosomes form these tubules, and these events have been well noted or well documented in immune cells like macrophages and dendritic cells when they are activated by the by molecules from bacteria like, lipopolysaccharides or LPS. So in LPS treated macrophages and dendritic cells, lysosomes form these extensive tubules, and this process of deformation of lysosomal membrane has been shown to be dependent on RL8 skip and kinesin 1 motor. So, while we were looking at this RL8 skip dependent lysosomal positioning events, we also were searching for new effectors of RL8, and in doing these screening experiments, both unbiased as well as a more targeted screening for identification of new effectors of RL8, one particular molecule, jumped out of the screen, which is this protein called as FLECM-M1, and we were excited to find this positive interaction partner in our screen because FLECM-M1, just from a zoomed out perspective, showed a very similar domain architecture to the known effector of RL8 skip. And I think this is emphasized if you know the other name of skip, which is FLECM-M2. And these names are given to these proteins because of the presence of these plextrin homology domain within these proteins, which are generally regarded as lipid binding or lipid, domains which have affinity for certain lipids. So what we found was that FLECM-M1 has it interacts with RL8 in a very similar fashion as skip through the N-terminal run domain, and particular amino acids in this proteins, were very similar to each other. The particular binding motif had a very strong similarity between them, which they were using for binding to RL8. But what was, very exciting for us was that when we saw the distribution of these two effectors in the cell along with RL8, and I want to share this data with you here. So when we looked at, punctae or endosomes that were positive for skip and RL8, it was very clear to us that, the co-localization was present only in the peripheral endosomes or peripheral lysosomes of the cell. Unlike skip and RL8 distribution of FLECM-M1 and RL8 actually had this, opposing phenotype where FLECM-M1 and RL8 structures were actually distributed in the perinuclear region of the cell. So this was very exciting that you have two effectors of RL8 which have a very similar way of binding to this small g protein, but which have a very distinct distribution to either the peripheral lysosomes or to the perinuclear late endosomes and lysosomes, suggesting that there is a competition probably between these two proteins for binding to RL8. I'm not showing you the data here, but we did a lot of biochemistry in this study to show that actually, yes, the run domain of FLECM-M1 and run domain of skip compete for binding to RL8. But I want to talk more about this particular effector of RL8. So when we expressed this protein in the cell, we saw that the spatial density or that dynamic clustering of lysosomes greatly increased. And this FLECM-M1 overexpressing cells showed a strong perinuclear clustering of lysosomes, which, as I've shown you earlier in that G. Wang's work, was probably the sites where these proteins are interacting with other compartments such as late endosomes. And this effect or this distribution of FLECM-M1 was RL8 dependent, because if you express a mutant of this effector of RL8, which cannot, now interact with the small g protein, you do not see the clustering phenotype that we saw with the wild type protein. And again, when we expressed this particular effector of RL8 and looked at interaction between late endosomes and lysosomes, we saw that this interaction between endosomes and lysosomes and their tethering was drastically increased. So in these live imaging snapshots that I'm sharing with you, the green color marks the endosomes or the late endosomes of the cell, which is this protein called as RAP7. And the more later compartments or lysosomes are marked by RL8. So in a typical, wild type HeLa cells where these two proteins are expressed in their fluorescent version, we see that, these two proteins come transiently together, and, there is some content exchange probably happening there, and then they move out, or they are, they have a transient kiss and run event, as one would say. But in cells which were expressing FLECM-M1, we saw that these compartments were kind of, almost immobile and permanently tethered. And we saw many distinct such clusters in the cell. And in the cells which were expressing a dominant negative mutant of FLECM-M1, which cannot bind to RL8, actually we saw a very clear separation of the late endosomal compartments which were stuck in the perinuclear region and RL8 positive lysosomes which were kind of, present in the peripheral space. So expression of this dominant negative FLECM-M1 version actually, I think it disrupted the interaction between a mature endosome and lysosomes. And we could see that the protein degradation was significantly impaired in the cells which are expressing this version of FLECM-M1. And so finally, as going along with these results, that FLECM-M1 promotes this spatial density of lysosomes in the perinuclear region where they have more chance to interact with the other endosomal compartments and possibly mediate cargo degradation. We actually measured the degradation of one particular cargo. So this is an artificial probe that we used here. It's called as DQBSA. And here this probe is generally, stays in this, in a non-fluorescent or quenched state. And once this probe is taken up by the cell by endocytosis, delivered to late endosomes, which then would ideally fuse with lysosomes, DQBSA would be degraded and the fluorescence will be dequenched. So whatever punctate you are seeing here, these are the degradative endolysomal compartments of the cell. And immediately we could appreciate that upon knockdown of this particular effector of RL8, the number of degradative, endolysosomes was greatly reduced, and this could be restored by expression of the wild type form of this protein. So you could restore the DQBSA punctate if you expressed now a version of FLECM-M1 which is resistant to the siRNA treatment. But we could not see rescue with a version which does not causes this, clustering or tethering of the compartment, as I showed you in an earlier image, suggesting that FLECM-M1 is, this effector which is repositioning lysosomes, RL8 positive lysosomes in the perinuclear region, increasing their spatial density so that they can now have a more, they have a more chance to encounter a late endosome or an autophagosome for degradation purposes. So with that, I just want to summarize this work that, these two effectors of RL8, skip and FLECM-M1 compete for binding to each other. They have a distinct localization, probably mediated by, by the fact that they can recognize different lipids as well as different proteins like RAP7 here. So they have a distinct distribution to either peripheral compartments or the perinuclear compartments, whereas skip and RL8 complex is more dedicated for, let's say, the signaling events or mTORC activation or secretion of lysosomes. Association of RL8 by FLECM-M1 would reposition lysosomes in the perinuclear region, increase their clustering so that they can interact with the late endosomes and degrade the autophagic or the endocytic cargo which is present in these compartments. And so what is very exciting for us now is we are trying to understand that how these interactions, what determines that RL8 would be in a skip complex or a Flecken M1 complex. Are these interactions under some regulation, for instance, by the kinase mTORC1 itself? So probably, one can imagine a hypothetical scenario that under presence of nutrients, when mTORC is activated, probably there is a post-translational modification like a phosphorylation event, which is guiding RL8 association with one particular effector to promote, a more anabolic phenotype of the cell. And under conditions of nutrient starvation, possibly RL8 is choosing the Flecken M1 pathway for mediating degradation of the cellular cargo. In the next few slides, I just want to share with you some unpublished work. And this is, this has been very exciting to us because it's again linked to this, the lysosome positioning or lysosomal distribution. I'm showing you this slide because in the early work, almost the first paper on this G protein, it was noted that, expression or overexpression of RL8 in the cell, it increases these events of long continuous motion of lysosomes. So cells which are overexpressing RL8 have a almost double the number of lysosomes that are moving on this microtubule tract. And this the events are not only in anterograde direction but rather also in the towards the cell body, that is in the retrograde direction, suggesting that like skip which recruits kinesin 1, there could be an elusive, effector of RL8, which can possibly recruit the retrograde motor also on lysosomes. And in one of these recent screens, we have identified one such protein called as RUFI3, standing for run and 5-domain containing protein, which actually has binding sites for both RL8 as well as the retrograde motor dynin. And so, in cells which are co-expressing RUFI3 along with RL8, what we see is that RL8 is no longer present on the peripheral, region of the cell, and rather it is all accumulated in the perinuclear space. And in live cell imaging videos of cells which are knocked down of this particular effector of RL8 RUFI3, we actually see now a strong, population of these peripheral lysosomes, possibly, present there because the dynin motor can no longer be efficiently recruited on these structures. And we also find that the run lengths of these lysosomes, because they are moving now more in the anterograde direction, is increased upon knockdown of RUFI3. Something else that we have noted in these cells is that, the lysosomes actually are smaller in RUFI3 knockdown cells as compared to the control cells. And so we find that the average lysosomal volume has actually reduced by a large percentage of between 40 to 50%. And we are now exploring the idea that could this be an imbalance of motors which is driving more lysosomal tubulation and subsequently fission events. So that is something that is still ongoing. Yeah, so right at the end of my talk, and I've just put in some, open questions here, specifically from the perspective of RL8 on this slide, that, there are many things that we do not know about this G protein, although it has this profound role in regulating lysosomal distribution. For instance, the basic question of what are the compartments that are marked by RL8, whether they are the degradative lysosomes or possibly this, terminal lysosomes, which are thought to be in this non-degradative class. What regulates RL8 localization on lysosomal membranes? What are the identities of its, GEFs, which mediate this GTP to GTP exchange, or its gap, which would hydrolyze promote hydrolysis of GTP and convert RLate into a more inactive state, how these regulators are influenced by the exogenous exogenous factors such as nutrients, stress pathways, oncogenic signaling or pathogens is unknown. And I think there are, like we have seen for other G proteins, there are many effectors of this molecule yet waiting to be discovered, which may regulate lysosome biology. So this was more from the RLate perspective, but I want to just end it at a, at a more bigger, with a bigger question that although lysosome positioning has been now shown to be a very important determinant of various roles of lysosome, it is still not understood that how these upstream molecules, upstream signals would influence lysosome positioning. What is the process which is altered, when these events take place, whether it is the bidirectional transport of lysosomes on microtubule tracks, whether it is association with the actin tracks, whether the ER lysosome contacts are changed, whether biogenesis of these compartments is altered. And another question that I think would be very exciting to study would be that if these two spatially distributed pools of lysosomes, are they same or are they different? And there is some evidence to say that they might be different because the lysosomes which are residing in the cell periphery have been shown in at least in one study to be less acidic and probably belonging to this class of non-degradative compartments. And I've thrown here an idea which has come to me from this RUFI3 study, that could it be possible that the two populations of lysosomes that we see at the steady state may represent different stages of lysosome maturation, with the newly formed lysosomes at the cell periphery and the more mature lysosomes in the perinuclear region. So I think I'll end it here, but yeah, just right at the end, I want to emphasize this very recent work on RLate, which I think is very very exciting. So this image is probably coming close to the double helix now for many researchers, not letting go of the past as of now. So this exciting work has been done by the lab of Nihal Bennett at NIH, where they have shown that beta coronaviruses, when they invade the epithelial cells, for instance, they form the newly assembled viruses in the ER Golgi compartments. But instead of using these Golgi derived vesicles for egressing or exiting from the cells, which would be the case for many cellular cargo, the pathogen actually moves away from the secretory route, and actually the Golgi derived newly assembled viruses fuse with lysosomes. And this group has shown that now they move into these deacidified lysosomes and are exocytosed from the cell in an RLate dependent manner. And depletion or knockdown of RLate actually reduces the egress of these newly packaged viruses into the extracellular milieu. So yeah, so at the end of my talk, I want to acknowledge the people who have done the work. Most of the work that I've shown you here today has been done by students who have already kind of exocytosed from the lab and moved on to newer positions. The RUFI3 work that we have done is with collaboration with Amit's lab at IMTech, and his student Gaurav has immensely contributed to that work. And I want to acknowledge the funding agencies, India Alliance, DBT Wellcome Funding, and ICER Mohali for their generous support. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mehak, for the fantastic talk, the introduction, and the work pertaining to endosomal positioning. We're happy to take questions from both the sessions. Let's start with Urvashi Nakul.
Hello, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, so it's kind of a general question, and it's from the first session that you have shown a picture where the transportation of cargo from outer membranes of the cell to the nucleus. The with the like it's a schematic showing with the blue curves connecting the outer with the inner part of the cell.
Okay.
So my question is, it's kind of a directed motion that it should be in a shortest distance, that cargo should be transported in a minimal time. It cannot be randomly chosen all the parts. Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what suggests that like a signal or some signal processing or temperature gradient which makes it flow from one part of the cell to the another? Like, I don't understand what is the reason it takes minimum distance or minimum time, you can say.
So Urvashi, if I get your question correctly, you are saying that what determines that the endosome, the maturing endosome, will take the minimal distance or time to get into the mature
Nucleus.
state or move into the perinuclear region.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not very sure of what are the determining factors, or even the fact that whether these endosomes do take up this, this minimal distance and time approach. In at least in live cell imaging videos, what one finds is that there is a lot of back and forth movement of the endosomes as they are trafficking from the transporting from the periphery of the cell to the perinuclear region. But quickly, what happens is that, so in terms of molecules, I can tell you that the the coat or the the external surface of these endosomes changes its identity. What happens is that within minutes of these endosome forming, the RAP5 compartment converts or matures into a RAP7 compartment. And we know the details of this process by now. We know that how individual molecules come on these membranes, replacing, the RAP5 compartment, or changing the RAP5 compartment identity into a RAP7 compartment. And once significant amount of RAP7 is present on these membranes, it can recruit, the retrograde motor dynein. And I think that that is where this fast transport into the perinuclear space would begin. So the pivotal movement, the pivotal point must be, a conversion of a RAP5 state into a RAP7 state. And then the RAP7 would determine association with the retrograde motor dynein and quick movement into the perinuclear space.
Okay. So it means that there is no presence of kinesin at that moment.
No, that's not correct. I think that the RAP5 does recruit a kinesin which moves in the opposite direction. Actually, it moves in the retrograde direction. But I'm forgetting, what particular kinesin it is. It's true that the RAP5, compartment also, if you will see in live cell imaging, you will see that, it is moving mostly in the retrograde direction. But I think that that movement might be more oscillating or might be more back and forth. And this, the clustering or this fast movement into the perinuclear space would begin when this exchange between RAP5 and RAP7 happens.
Okay. Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Right. Srilaja, could you go ahead and ask your question?
Okay. So Mahek, my question is a little bit to do with the 3D organization. Because I work on embryos, so I think not just in terms of a single cell, but like a complex tissue.
Yeah.
So is there any evidence that the intracellular mechanisms that you discussed for lysosomal trafficking is modulated or influenced by extracellular shape changes. So there are two possibilities. One is that an extracellular shape change, like a whole bunch of cells moving together, like cell migration, because you
Yeah.
initially talked about cell migration, influences the lysosomal, endolysosomal pathway intracellularly. And the other possibility is that the endolysosomal pathway actually influences how it migrates, like an outside out versus an uh, outside in or an inside out view of looking at things. So is
Right.
there any evidence that the lysosomal processing actually plays a role in shaping tissues or organization of cells?
Srilaja, I'm not very much aware of that literature, but what I know, so I don't know the details, but I know that, lysosomes, for instance, or lysosome function is very important in, let's say, architecture or involution of the mammary gland. But what I don't know is that if that is linked more to the degradative function of lysosomes. So
Okay.
lysosomes moving into the lysosomes exocytosing their content, which would
Okay.
then clear away the extracellular matrix and make
Okay.
make way for more cells to come in.
Okay.
So it
Okay.
could be that. I know that there are labs like Tamal Das's lab now who are exploring lysosome positioning in collective cell migration.
Okay.
And but I think that that work is still in its native stages, and we'll
Okay.
come to know what do they find. So one idea is that that's a simple idea to begin with, that lysosomes secrete their content into the extracellular milieu, degrade the matrix, making way for the tissue to remodel.
Right.
But whether there is more to it, whether lysosomes are actually regulating migration of these cells because they regulate focal adhesion, assembly, disassembly, I think this has not been studied.
Okay. What about the possibility that so let's say if you're considering an epithelial cell, is there an apicobasal polarity in how the lysosome is distributed in a sheet of cells that inherently have a polarity? Because though we study these processes in cells in culture,
Yeah.
In a endogenous situation, these cells inherently have a polarity to it, which in turn dictates the polarity of an overall organ or an embryo. So is there anything known how endolysosomal pathway map to a polarized cell?
Um,
Apicobasal
I,
polarized.
so my guess would be, I'm just guessing here. My guess is that even in a polarized cell, we see this compartmentalization of the endolysosomal system.
Right.
That the majority or the bulk of lysosomes are still present in the perinuclear cloud or the
Okay.
perinuclear region.
Okay.
And so the compartmentalization of the endolysosomal system remains similar to the non-polarized cells. That would be my guess, but yeah, I
Because
have not come across any studies on this.
in the picture that you have shown,
Yeah.
the assumption is that what you're showing, for example, on this slide, is
Yeah.
true for all 360 degrees of the cell. Like if you consider the cell as a circle, that's
Yeah.
the general assumption.
That
And
would be the general assumption, yes. But
it, it may not hold true.
yes, it may not hold true. For instance, I know that there are in the polarized cell, the endosome itself, the early endosome itself has different identities.
Right.
There is an apical endosome and there is a basolateral endosome.
Okay. Okay.
And I am not sure if that holds true for lysosomes. I have not come across that. And
Okay.
I do think that generally the proteolytic compartment or lysosomes, late endosomes have not been as thoroughly studied in polarized cells.
Okay.
At the organismal level, like in Drosophila, for instance, the lysosome function is very well studied, and this is mostly in the neurons.
Okay.
Where their motility has been studied in depth.
Okay.
And then yeah, lysosomes regulate the axon growth RL8 regulates exon growth.
Right.
This has been well documented.
Okay. Thanks, Meher. Nice talk. Thanks.
All right. Next is questions from Shivani.
Hello.
Yeah, Shivani.
Does the normal pH change of the cytosol regulate if RLate1 could bind with skip or flecamin1?
Yeah. So that is a very interesting experiment. We have not yet done that, but yeah, David Rubinson's group at David Rubinson's group at Cambridge, I think they have shown that RL8 levels reduce when when the pH of lysosomes or pH of the cytosol is more basic. So they have found that RL8 levels reduce with the change in cytosolic pH, and so the assumption would be then the recruitment of RL8 effectors would be reduced under basic conditions.
So can we say that the number of mitochondria in a cell would regulate the number of lysosomes or their movement? Is there any connection?
Yeah, I can't think of. So number of mitochondria would have connections to the number of lysosomes. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know about this. That's an interesting idea. So mitochondria and lysosomes form extensive contacts. That is known. If they influence the numbers of one organelle influencing the number of another organelle, I think it's, yeah, I've not come across this.
Or is there any way a mitochondria communicates with lysosome about the pH or something?
So there are these contact sites between mitochondria and lysosomes, which probably have some material exchange. There is some content exchange that also happens between the two organelles, and that would automatically imply that probably mitochondria can regulate, for instance, lysosomal pH, but the actual experimental evidence might be lacking. One thing that I've recently come across is that iron homeostasis is of iron homeostasis, or how iron regulates mitochondrial function is regulated by lysosomes. So lysosomes export out this iron, and this is then regulating the mitochondrial function.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
All right. Vaishnavi, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, Mehak, fantastic talk. I really found your last part of the talk where you spoke about the RUFI3, the protein that you think is required to recruit dynein. Are you proposing that RUFI3 might be cargo adapter for dynein on lysosomes? And if so, do you think it could be an activating adapter like the others that we know of?
So Vaishnavi, we think that yes, it is a cargo adapter on lysosomes. If we deplete RUFI3 from the cells and you measure the levels of dynein subunits on lysosomes, and this is by subcellular fractionation, we do find that association of dynein on lysosomes is reduced. On the other hand, if you overexpress RUFI3, you find that dynein association with lysosomes is enhanced. We also know that if you can mislocalize RUFI3 on another organelle like mitochondria, you would now start seeing perinuclear clustering of mitochondria, which is dynein dependent. But whether it is an activating adapter is something that we have not yet analyzed, whether association between dynein and dynactin is increased, and whether there is any changes in the in conformation of these proteins in presence of RuFi3 is not yet addressed. I do want to point out that Samara Peterson's lab had a eLife paper on, fishing out new dynein adapters. And in one of their figures, they actually show the RuFi proteins, RuFi1 and RuFi3 as, likely examples of activating adapters of dynein.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Mehak. Very nice.
All right. Mehak, if I could go on and request you to comment on something that you showed in your last slide as well, which is the idea that you may not have two different populations of endosomes, but they may be interchanging or maybe progressing from one to the other. Would you please comment on whether this is the general theme for many different kinds of endosomes, and technically, what are the experimental capabilities that one would need to go further along this idea? I think that will build nicely into what probably Pearson is going to talk about on endosomal maturation. So it would be nice to marry technology and theoretical.
So yes, I do think that, at least for the endosomes, it seems so that their position determines their state of maturation, with the more naive or pre-early endosomes present in the more periphery of the cell. And as they mature, they change their identities. They move into this perinuclear space. So indeed, for an endosome, that has been the model, that as they're maturing, they are moving into the perinuclear space. And so the distribution of a earlier immature compartment is different from a mature endosome. For lysosomes, I'm not sure if there is very strong experimental evidence, other than the fact that, there is a size regulation. So the more mature compartments, which are LAMP1 positive, are, they are bigger in size, and they are all located in the perinuclear region. Whereas, let's say, lysosomes, which are, have less volume, and possibly are, less rich in hydrolases. Maybe they have inactive hydrolases because their pH may not be acidic yet, have been found to be located in the more peripheral spaces in the cell. But the evidence there is scanty, and I think there is a lot of work that still needs to be done to establish this paradigm for lysosomes. I think that, high resolution imaging, for instance, could be one way by which this can be addressed. For instance, if you see that these tubulation and fission events, a process which has been now called as lysosome reformation, can be visualized by this, high-speed, high-resolution imaging. And if one can see that, these tubulation and fission events are happening, and they have a certain directionality to them, that the perinuclear mature lysosomes, after they have fused with an endosome or an autophagosome, you see this tubulation and fission event from this compartment, giving rise to a newly formed lysosome, which then moves into the peripheral space because of attachment to kinesin motor, for instance. I think that kind of evidence can actually bring in, bring some bring some merit to this idea that indeed these two populations of lysosomes, as we would call them, are at different stages of their maturation. And possibly, if somehow we can isolate these two compartments, I'm not sure of how that can be done, or if these biochemical fractionation can even be done without their drawbacks. But one idea is that to isolate these different populations of lysosome and figure out what is present on their surfaces and the lumen, and what are the differences.
Thank you very much, Mehak, for that.
Thank you, Mehak.
Thank you, Santanya.
Thanks a lot, Mehak. Very nice.
Thank you, Vaishnavi.